hands behind your back. Don't move. I'm not resisting. I'm complying. Keep them right there. Spread your feet. I'd like to speak to a supervisor. You talk when I say, do not move. My name is Kareem Alston. I am a federal judge.
He walked to his car after work, calm and compliant. But within seconds, a stranger's assumption turned a quiet garage into a moment that would cost millions. If you've ever stayed late at work and felt that strange mix of relief and exhaustion when you finally head out, this will feel familiar. The kind of night where your shoulders drop the moment you step outside, because all you want is your car, your couch, and silence. That was Kareem Alston's night. He pushed through the glass doors of the federal office building in downtown Phoenix, the lock clicking behind him with a sharp, final sound. His day had stretched longer than planned. Briefs to review, notes to clean up, a hearing that refused to leave his head. Nothing dramatic, just work that demanded attention even after the lights on most floors had gone dark. Kareem adjusted the strap of his briefcase and glanced up at the sky. The air was warm, the street mostly empty. No crowds, no chatter, just the distant sound of traffic and the echo of his own footsteps as he headed toward the parking structure across the street. Inside the garage, the lights cast pale circles on the concrete. His shoes tapped against the floor as he walked, each step louder than the last. Rows of cars sat untouched, like they'd been forgotten. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing his keys, already thinking about what leftovers might still be in his fridge. Halfway down the row, he heard it. Tires. Fast. Too fast for a place like this. Before Kareem could turn around, red and blue lights flooded the garage walls, bouncing off metal and glass. A patrol cruiser rolled in behind him, stopping at an angle that blocked the exit. The engine stayed on. Kareem stopped walking. A door swung open. Boots hit concrete. "Hey!" a voice called out, sharp and loud. "You! Don't move!" Kareem turned slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Is something wrong, officer?" Officer Paul Kincaid stepped forward, one hand already near his belt. His posture was rigid, his eyes locked on Kareem like he'd already made a decision. "What are you doing in here?" Kincaid asked. "I'm heading to my car," Kareem said, nodding toward the row behind him. "I work in the building across the street." Kincaid didn't respond. He took another step closer. "You're here pretty late," the officer said. "Turn around." Kareem frowned, confusion crossing his face. "I'm sorry, why?" "Hands behind your back," Kincaid said, louder this time. "Now." The words hit harder than Kareem expected. His heart picked up speed, not from fear, but from disbelief. "Officer," Kareem said carefully, "I think there's been a mistake. I'm not doing anything wrong." Kincaid's jaw set. "I didn't ask for an explanation." Kareem glanced around. The garage was still mostly empty, but a couple had just stepped out of the stairwell near the elevators. They slowed when they saw the lights, whispering to each other. Kareem could feel their eyes on him. "I'm happy to answer questions," Kareem said, keeping his voice level. "But I don't understand why you're treating this like..." "Hands behind your back." The command echoed off the concrete walls. Kareem hesitated for half a second, not out of refusal, out of shock. Then he started to comply, moving slowly, deliberately, the way everyone tells you to. That half second was all it took. Kincaid closed the distance fast. His hand grabbed Kareem's arm, twisting it upward and back. The pain came quick and sharp, shooting through Kareem's shoulder. "Hey, wait," Kareem said, wincing. "I'm complying." Kincaid didn't answer. He pressed Kareem forward, chest against the side of the car. The metal was still warm from the day. Kareem's briefcase slipped from his shoulder and hit the ground with a dull thud. "Stay still," Kincaid said. "I am," Kareem replied through clenched teeth. "I'm not resisting." The couple by the elevator had stopped completely now. One of them pulled out a phone, holding it low at first, then higher. Kareem saw the reflection of flashing lights ripple across the hood of the car. "This isn't necessary," Kareem said. Can you please call a supervisor? Kincaid ignored him, adjusting his grip. Kareem stared straight ahead, breathing slow, trying to keep his voice steady. He'd seen situations like this before, read about them, heard people talk about how fast things could go wrong. He never imagined standing inside one himself. All he'd done was walk to his car after work. But what happened next would turn a quiet garage into a place no one involved would ever forget. The grip on Kareem's arm tightened, not loosened. "Sir, you're hurting me," Kareem said, his voice strained but controlled. "I'm cooperating." Officer Paul Kincaid leaned closer, his breath close enough that Kareem could smell coffee and something sharp underneath it. "Then stop talking." "I have the right to ask why I'm being detained," Kareem replied. "And I'd like a supervisor." That did it. Kincaid shifted his weight and pressed Kareem harder against the car. The metal edge dug into Kareem's ribs. His shoulder screamed as his arm was forced higher. "You don't get to run the show," Kincaid snapped. "You do what you're told." The couple near the elevator exchanged looks. The man raised his phone higher now, no longer trying to hide it. "Hey," the woman said, her voice shaky. "He said he works here." Kincaid shot her a look. "Ma'am, step back." Kareem took a slow breath. He knew this moment. The space where every word mattered, where tone mattered, where staying calm wasn't about pride, but survival. "I'm not resisting," Kareem said again. "I'm asking you to explain what's going on." Kincaid reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I've got a subject refusing commands in the federal garage." Kareem turned his head slightly. "That's not accurate," he said. "I'm complying." "Face forward," Kincaid barked. Kareem did. The radio crackled. Voices overlapped. Kincaid listened, then glanced back at Kareem like he was seeing him for the first time, not as a person, but as a problem to solve quickly. "You got identification on you?" Kincaid asked. "Yes," Kareem said. "In my jacket pocket. I can get it if you let me." "Don't move," Kincaid said immediately. "I can't show it without moving," Kareem replied. "That's why I'm asking you to." Kincaid cut him off. "You should have thought about that earlier." The words landed heavy. Kareem swallowed hard. A new set of headlights appeared at the garage entrance. Another patrol cruiser rolled in, slower this time, parking a few spaces away. Officer Lena Morano stepped out, scanning the scene. She took in the body language first, the bystanders, the phone recording. Kareem pinned to the car. "What's going on?" Morano asked. "Suspicious person in a restricted area," Kincaid said without hesitation. "Didn't follow commands." Kareem turned his head again. "That's not true," he said. "I asked questions. I never refused." Morano approached carefully. "Sir, what's your name?" Before Kareem could answer, Kincaid snapped, "I've got it under control." Morano paused, then looked at Kareem directly. "Sir?" "Kareem Alston," he said. "I work in the building across the street. I'm asking to speak to a supervisor." Morano's eyes flicked to the building, then back to Kareem. "What do you do there?" "I'm a judge," Kareem said plainly. The word didn't land right away. It hovered between them, waiting to be processed. "A what?" Kincaid asked. "A federal judge," Kareem said. "My chambers are on the 6th floor." Morano blinked. She looked at Kincaid, then at Kareem again. "Is that true?" she asked. "Yes," Kareem said. "You can confirm it right now." Kincaid let out a short laugh. "Anyone can say that." Morano didn't laugh. "Paul," she said quietly, "let's slow this down." Kincaid hesitated. His grip loosened just a fraction. "I'd like my arm back in front of me," Kareem said. "Please." Morano stepped closer. "Paul, relax your hold." For a moment, it looked like Kincaid might argue. His eyes darted toward the phone recording, toward the other cruiser, toward the radio still crackling on his shoulder. Then, reluctantly, his hand eased off. Kareem exhaled, rolling his shoulder carefully as blood rushed back into his arm. The pain stayed, but the pressure was gone. Morano gestured toward Kareem's jacket. "May I see your identification?" Kareem nodded. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge holder. He opened it and held it up. Morano leaned in. Her expression changed instantly. "Oh," she said under her breath. She straightened and looked at Kincaid. "We need a supervisor here. Now." Kincaid's face drained of color. The garage felt smaller suddenly, quieter. Even the bystanders stopped whispering. Kareem stood there, rubbing his wrist, saying nothing. He didn't need to anymore. But the realization of who Kareem was had only just begun to sink in, and the hardest part of the night was still ahead. Silence settled over the garage in a strange way. Not calm, not peaceful, just heavy. The kind that presses against your ears once shouting stops, and everyone realizes something serious is happening. Officer Lena Morano took a small step back after reading the badge. She didn't hand it back right away. She didn't speak either. Her eyes moved from the badge to Kareem's face, then over to Officer Paul Kincaid, who now stood stiff beside the cruiser, arms locked at his sides. "Kareem Alston," Morano said carefully, reading it again. "United States District Court." Kareem nodded. "That's correct." The couple by the elevator whispered to each other. The man kept recording, his phone steady now, like he understood this wasn't something he wanted to miss. Morano keyed her radio. "I need a supervisor at my location." Kincaid shifted his weight. "That's not necessary," he said quickly. "We can clear this up." Morano didn't look at him. "I already asked." Kareem leaned back against the car, stretching his shoulder as subtly as he could. It ached in a way he knew would last longer than tonight. Still, he focused on his breathing, on keeping his voice even. "I asked multiple times for a supervisor," he said quietly. "I was ignored." Kincaid finally met his eyes. "You didn't need to make this complicated." Kareem let out a short, controlled breath. "I walked to my car." The radio chirped. A supervisor confirmed they were on the way. Morano handed Kareem his badge. "I'm sorry for the confusion, sir," she said. Kareem took it and slipped it back into his pocket. "Confusion doesn't explain being grabbed." Morano nodded once. She didn't argue. Another patrol unit pulled in, followed by a dark SUV marked with department insignia. Sergeant Adrian Buckley stepped out, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He surveyed the scene in seconds. The recording phone, Kareem's stiff stance, Kincaid's tight jaw. "What happened?" Buckley asked. Before Kincaid could answer, Kareem spoke. "I was detained without cause while walking to my car after work. I identified myself and asked for a supervisor. I was ignored." Buckley looked at Kincaid. "Is that accurate?" Kincaid opened his mouth, then closed it. "I believed he was in a restricted area." Buckley raised an eyebrow. "Based on what?" Kincaid didn't answer right away. Morano stepped in. "He was cooperative the entire time." Buckley nodded slowly. "Sir," he said to Kareem, "are you injured?" "My shoulder," Kareem replied. "My wrist." Buckley exhaled through his nose. "We're going to document everything." The couple near the elevator spoke up again. "We saw the whole thing," the woman said. "He wasn't doing anything." Buckley gestured gently. "I appreciate that. Someone will take your statement." Kareem watched as another officer approached the witnesses. The phone kept recording. No one told them to stop. Buckley turned back to Kareem. "Judge Alston, you're free to go." Kareem nodded. "I was free before this started." Buckley accepted that without comment. Kincaid stood a few steps away, staring at the floor. The confidence he'd shown earlier was gone, replaced by something tight and defensive. Morano glanced at him. "You okay?" she asked Kareem. Kareem paused before answering. "I will be." The garage began to empty. The witnesses left. The flashing lights dimmed. But the weight of what had happened stayed behind, clinging to the concrete walls. Kareem picked up his briefcase from the ground, brushing dust from the corner. His hand shook slightly. He hated that it did. As he walked toward the exit, Buckley called after him. "Judge Alston?" Kareem turned. "We'll be in touch," Buckley said. Kareem met his eyes. "I expect that you will." He drove home in silence, replaying the moment his arm was pulled back, the sound of his briefcase hitting the ground, the way no explanation had mattered until his title did. At home, he set his keys down and leaned against the counter, letting the tension finally drain from his shoulders. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, something had shifted. This hadn't ended in the garage. It had only changed shape. But once the footage began circulating and questions started spreading beyond that concrete room, the story took on a life of its own. By the time the supervisor's SUV pulled away from the garage, the air felt heavier than before, like the space itself was holding a memory it didn't want to release. Kareem sat in his car for a moment with the engine running, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. His phone vibrated. A message from his clerk. Another from a colleague. Someone had already heard. He drove home through streets he'd taken 100 times, stopping at the same lights, turning at the same corners. But nothing felt routine anymore. At every red light, his shoulder reminded him what had happened. A dull ache. Constant. Patient. At home, Kareem didn't turn on the television. He didn't pour a drink. He loosened his tie, set his briefcase down, and stood in the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator kick on and off. The phone vibrated again. This time, it was a call. "Kareem," a familiar voice said the moment he answered. "Are you all right?" It was Judge Samuel Reiner, a colleague whose chambers were 2 floors down from his. "I've been better," Kareem said. "I just saw a clip," Reiner said. "Someone posted it online. Is that you?" Kareem closed his eyes. "Yes." There was a pause. "They grabbed you," Reiner said quietly. "Yes." "You need to document everything," Reiner said. "Tonight." "I know." By morning, the footage was everywhere. Not because Kareem shared it. He didn't. The witnesses did. A shaky angle at first. Flashing lights. A voice saying, "Hands behind your back." Then the stillness. Then the shift. The part people replayed most was not the grab. It was the moment Kareem said his name. "I'm Judge Kareem Alston," his voice said in the video. Calm. Flat. Clear. The change was immediate. Even through a phone screen, you could feel it. The pause. The recalculation. The silence where authority had nowhere to hide. By midday, Kareem's office phone would not stop ringing. Reporters, advocacy groups, friends he hadn't spoken to in years. One message stood out. "Call me as soon as you can," it read. Signed by Chief Judge Eleanor Price. When Kareem stepped into her office later that afternoon, she didn't ask him to sit. She hugged him. "I'm sorry this happened to you," she said. Kareem exhaled. "So am I." They watched the footage together. No sound, just images. "Did you resist?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "No." "Did you raise your voice?" "No." She nodded slowly. "This is not about compliance," she said. "It never is." The department issued a short statement before the end of the day. It used careful language, phrases that sounded clean and distant. An internal review. Policy. Training. Kareem read it once and put it down. That night, he received a call from Sergeant Adrian Buckley. "I wanted to follow up," Buckley said. "Make sure you're okay." "I appreciate that," Kareem replied. "But I want to be clear. This wasn't confusion. This was assumption." Buckley didn't argue. "I understand." "Do you?" Kareem asked. Another pause. "I'm trying to," Buckley said. In the days that followed, Kincaid's name surfaced quietly. Not in headlines, in memos. Administrative leave. Pending review. Kareem wasn't interested in revenge. He was interested in accountability. In the question no one wanted to answer out loud. What happens when someone without a title is in that garage? He returned to the bench the following week. Same courtroom. Same seal on the wall. Same oath. But when he looked out at the people standing before him, he saw them differently, not as cases, as moments away from being misunderstood. During a recess, his clerk leaned in. "People are saying the settlement could be huge." Kareem shook his head. "This isn't about money." "But it might become that," she said. He knew she was right. The story had moved past the garage, past the footage. It was about precedent now, about whether harm required recognition before it could be corrected. Kareem stood at the window of his chambers that evening, watching the city settle into night again. Somewhere, another garage, another set of flashing lights. He wondered whose name would matter next. But as pressure mounted and the legal machinery began to move, the focus shifted from what happened to what it would cost. The public part of the story moved faster than Kareem expected. Within days, requests landed on his desk that had nothing to do with cases. Interview invitations, letters from advocacy groups, messages from people he had never met, all saying the same thing in different ways. "This happened to me too." Kareem read many of them late at night, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea he barely touched. Some stories were short. Others ran for pages. Different cities, different uniforms, same pattern. Questions asked after force, explanations dismissed, names that didn't carry weight. The department's internal review started quietly, but the pressure around it did not. Video experts slowed down the footage frame by frame. Former officers debated body positioning and tone. Lawyers pointed out how quickly the situation escalated and how slowly it was corrected. Officer Paul Kincaid was placed on leave. No badge, no patrol car, no statement beyond a brief note from his attorney saying he acted in good faith. Kareem read that line twice. Good faith did not twist his arm. Good faith did not ignore his words. Still, Kareem stayed measured. He declined most interviews. He released a single written statement, short and direct. He focused on facts, on impact, on the moment itself. Behind the scenes, conversations were less restrained. In a conference room lined with legal pads and cold coffee cups, Kareem sat across from attorneys representing the city. They spoke in calm voices, careful phrases, weighing risk like accountants balancing columns. "This could become very public," one of them said. "It already is," Kareem replied. Another attorney leaned forward. "We're prepared to discuss resolution." Kareem folded his hands. "I'm prepared to discuss responsibility." The talks stretched over weeks. Depositions followed. Kareem described the garage again and again. The lights, the command, the pressure. Each time, he stuck to the truth, even when it meant reliving the worst moments. At one point, an attorney asked, "Why do you think this happened to you?" Kareem didn't answer right away. "Because assumptions are easier than listening," he said, finally. Outside the legal rooms, the public conversation grew louder. Community meetings filled with people who wanted answers. Some wanted change. Some wanted someone punished. Others just wanted to be heard. Kareem attended one meeting quietly, sitting in the back. A young man stood at the microphone, voice shaking. "I did everything right," the man said. "And it still didn't matter." Kareem felt that sentence settle deep in his chest. When the settlement discussions reached their final stage, the number surprised even him: $9,100,000. It wasn't announced with fanfare. It appeared in documents first, then headlines. People argued about it instantly. Too much, not enough. About time, pointless. Kareem listened to none of it. He stood alone, in his chambers, the evening the agreement was finalized, staring at the framed oath on the wall. The words looked the same as they always had, but they felt heavier now. Justice, equal, law. He thought about the garage again, about how quickly things had turned, about how easily the story could have ended differently. A call came in from Sergeant Adrian Buckley. "It's official," Buckley said. "I know," Kareem replied. There was a pause. "I hope you understand this changes things." "I hope it does," Kareem said. "But I'm not sure it will." Buckley sighed. We're reviewing training, protocols, everything. Good, Kareem said. Start with listening. After the call, Kareem sat down and finally let himself feel it all at once. The anger, the exhaustion, the sadness that lingered under both. Money did not erase pain. It did not rewind time. It only acknowledged that harm had occurred. And acknowledgement, he had learned, was often the hardest thing to secure. Outside, the city lights flickered on as evening settled in again. Somewhere, someone was walking to their car after work, hoping for nothing more than to get home. Kareem hoped they would. But as the noise slowly faded and the headlines moved on, the real question remained. What was this moment meant to teach? The headlines faded faster than Kareem expected. One week, his name was everywhere. Panels argued. Comment sections overflowed. People spoke with certainty about things they had never lived. The next week, something else took its place. That was how attention worked. Life, however, did not reset. Kareem returned to his routine. Early mornings, long hearings, careful rulings that carried weight for people he would never see again. From the outside, nothing looked different. From the inside, everything did. He noticed how often people hesitated before speaking now, how clerks checked in more than usual, how security guards watched interactions a little longer than before. One afternoon, after court had recessed, a young public defender lingered near the bench. "Judge Alston," he said, clearing his throat. "I just wanted to say, thank you." Kareem looked up. "For what?" "For saying your name out loud," the man said. "For not letting it slide." Kareem studied him for a moment. "I didn't do anything special." The defender shook his head. "You did something visible." That stayed with Kareem. The settlement funds were distributed according to agreement. Portions went to causes Kareem had supported quietly for years. Legal aid clinics, community education programs, training initiatives that focused on communication instead of control. Money could not undo what happened in that garage, but it could push conversation into places where silence once lived. One evening, Kareem sat across from his sister, Nadira, at a small restaurant near their childhood neighborhood in Tucson. She had followed the story closely. Worry etched into her voice every time they spoke. "I still see it," she said softly. "Your arm, the way he pulled it." Kareem nodded. "I know. What scares me," she said, "is that nothing you did stopped it." "That's what scares everyone," Kareem replied, "because it means the rules people believe in don't always protect them." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Then what's the point?" Kareem thought for a long moment. The point is not giving up on accountability just because it's uncomfortable. In the months that followed, departments reached out asking Kareem to consult. Some were sincere, others wanted optics. He agreed to a few meetings and declined the rest. In one session, an officer asked, "What should I have done differently?" Kareem answered without hesitation, "You should have listened before you acted." The room went quiet. That was the lesson he returned to again and again. Not policy, not procedure. Listening. Because listening slowed things down. Listening created space. Listening reminded everyone involved that a human being stood in front of them, not a problem to control. Late one night, Kareem found himself in another parking structure after work. Different building, different city. Same echoing steps. A guard nodded at him. "Evening, sir." "Evening," Kareem replied. He reached his car without incident, sat behind the wheel for a moment. Hands steady, breath even. The memory did not vanish. It likely never would, but it no longer owned him. Before driving away, Kareem thought about the people who had written to him. The ones who never got an apology, never saw a supervisor arrive, never heard a tone shift when they said their name. That was who this mattered for. Not the cameras, not the settlement, not the headlines. People walking to their cars after long days, believing they should be safe simply because they exist. Kareem shared his story when asked now, not to relive it, but to remind others of something easy to forget. Power reveals itself in small moments, and so does responsibility. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's not a bad thing. It means you were paying attention. It means you understand that accountability does not happen by accident. It happens when people speak up, when they question, when they refuse to look away. So if you're watching this and thinking, "That could have been me," remember this. Listen before you act. Question before you judge. And never assume a moment is small just because it happened quickly. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, shared, and learned from, take a second to support the channel. Your attention keeps these conversations alive, and your voice helps make sure they do not fade when the next headline comes along. But the real work begins after the video ends, when each of us decides what kind of moment we create when we're given power.